He parked his brand new car in front of his house, the sunlight bouncing off its shining surface like a mirror. Children passing by slowed down to stare. Neighbors paused with bags in their hands, whispering about how beautiful and expensive it looked. The man smiled quietly as he locked the door and stepped inside, proud of what he had worked for. But he did not notice the eyes watching from across the street. The HOA president stood there with her arms crossed, her lips tight, her eyes filled with something darker than jealousy. She whispered something sharp into the ear of another neighbor, the kind of whisper that carried poison. And though no one around could hear clearly, everyone knew she was planning something. She always did. The HOA president had a reputation. She was the type who found faults in everything: a crooked mailbox, a flower bed too wide, a fence painted the wrong shade. She lived for rules, lived for control, and hated when someone dared to stand out. The new car in front of the man's house was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol, a reminder that someone had something she did not, and that was enough for her to see it as an enemy. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the spotless paint, the polished rims, the smooth tires, her mind spinning with thoughts of violations, fines, and ways to humiliate the man without ever breaking a law. Inside his house, the man poured himself a glass of water, unaware of the storm brewing outside. To him, it was just a car, his reward after years of saving and working late nights. He had chosen it carefully, even sacrificed vacations and weekends to make the down payment. When he drove it home, his heart raced with pride, his family cheered, and neighbors clapped lightly. But behind those polite smiles, there was always one person who could never feel happy for others. She had been president of the HOA for years. Her power came not from kindness but from fear, and now she had a new target. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, the car still gleamed under the fading light. A small group of neighbors stood nearby chatting, but their eyes often drifted toward the vehicle. They spoke about how unfair it was that the HOA president always made life difficult for anyone who tried to improve themselves. One neighbor mentioned how she fined him $500 for leaving his trash bin out an hour late. Another whispered about the time she threatened to sue someone over Christmas lights. The stories piled up like warnings, and still, the man inside his home remained calm, unaware of how many eyes were already on his car. The HOA president walked back and forth near her porch, pretending to sweep but always glancing at the shiny vehicle. Each time her face twisted tighter. She could already hear the sound of her own voice announcing a violation. She could already imagine the embarrassment on the man's face when he opened a letter demanding money. She thrived on control, and control only existed when people feared her. In her mind, the car was not just parked. It was a challenge to her authority, and challenges could never be ignored. That night, when the street grew quiet and the neighborhood lights dimmed, the car stood under the moon like a jewel, its curves glowing faintly. But in the shadows, the HOA president still watched. Her window blinds parted just enough to keep an eye on it. She thought about the rule book sitting on her desk, thick with papers, and how easily she could twist a line or bend a section to make the man guilty of something, anything. She smiled to herself, a thin and dangerous smile, because she believed no one could resist her power for long. Meanwhile, the man sat at his table, sipping tea, feeling peace in his heart. He did not chase attention. He did not boast. He lived quietly and worked hard. Yet trouble always found him in this neighborhood. He remembered stories his neighbors had told him when he first moved in. Warnings about the president's greed, about how she once forced a family to repaint their entire house because she disliked the shade of blue, about how she ruined friendships by turning neighbor against neighbor. He had listened but thought perhaps they exaggerated. Now, as the hours passed, he had no idea those warnings were about to become real in his life. As midnight neared, the car sat silent, but the street around it carried an uneasy feeling. Dogs barked randomly as if sensing something unseen. A curtain shifted in a nearby house. Someone whispered softly then went back inside. All the while, the HOA president could not sleep. She stared out, her eyes flashing each time the car caught the moonlight. To her, it was not just metal and wheels. It was defiance. It was pride that did not bow. And she could never allow that in her perfect little world of rules. The next morning, the man stepped out with a smile, ready for another day. He glanced at his car with quiet joy, the way some people might look at a trophy. But as he stood there, across the street, the president was already outside, her clipboard in hand, scribbling notes, muttering rules. The neighbor she whispered to yesterday stood beside her nervously, not daring to argue. The air felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. And though the man remained unaware, his new car had already declared a silent war. The neighborhood buzzed with tension. Children rode their bikes slower. Adults pretended not to notice the president's glare. But everyone knew she would not stop until she struck. And in that moment, the man realized the truth. It was not about the car. It was about control. About one person who could not stand to see another person happy. He sighed softly, touching the hood of his car as if to prepare it for the battles to come. Because deep down, even without proof, he felt it. The war had already begun, and this was only the first move. The next morning the street looked calm, but the man felt something different in the air as he stepped outside. His eyes moved to the windshield of his new car, and there it was. A bright yellow paper stuck under the wiper. At first he thought it might be an advertisement, but when he pulled it out his hands tightened. It was an official HOA violation notice. Bold letters claiming he had broken the rules by parking in front of his own home. His heart slowed, but his face stayed calm. Neighbors who passed by slowed their steps and glanced nervously. Everyone knew the style of those letters. It carried the weight of fines and threats. Across the street the HOA president stood with folded arms, pretending to chat with another neighbor, yet her eyes were locked on him, waiting for his reaction. She smiled faintly when she saw him reading the paper. She wanted shock or anger, but instead he folded the letter quietly and slipped it into his pocket. His silence bothered her more than any argument would. He walked around the car slowly, inspecting the tires, the hood, the lines of the body. Everything was fine. But that paper in his pocket felt heavy. He could already imagine what it said in detail: parking violations, threats of hundreds of dollars in fines, the possibility of legal action if he did not comply. He had seen others suffer under the same rules. One man forced to pay nearly $1,000 for leaving his garden tools outside overnight. Another fined for a crack in his driveway that rainwater had caused. Yet here he was, being punished for parking his car in front of his own home. It was a rule that never existed clearly, but the HOA president had a way of bending the book until it looked real. The neighbor next door approached quietly, his voice low. He asked if the man had already received a notice. When the man nodded, the neighbor shook his head with pity. He said she was starting early this time. Usually she waited a week before attacking. The man thanked him but said nothing more. Silence was his shield. He knew words would only feed her fire. Still the neighbor warned him that this was only the beginning. The president never stopped at just one letter. She liked to pile pressure. Slowly, first the notice, then the rumor, then the humiliation, until people either paid or left. Across the street the president leaned closer to her friend, whispering again. Her lips curved into a smile that did not belong to kindness. She enjoyed the way the crowd of neighbors pretended not to look but could not resist peeking at the scene. Every whisper, every glance. It was all fuel for her power. She believed control came from making others fear her, and if one man resisted, she had to break him quickly to set an example. Inside the house the man unfolded the letter and read it carefully. The words were twisted and harsh, accusing him of violating a section of the community code that barely mentioned parking. Yet at the bottom it demanded a $250 fine to be paid within 10 days. Failure to do so could result in further action. His hands tightened around the paper, but his face remained calm. He had expected something like this. He had heard too many stories to be surprised. He placed the paper on the table and made tea. The steam rose quietly as he sipped, while outside the storm continued to gather. That evening he walked to the mailbox and noticed more eyes watching him. People were whispering as if he had done something terrible. Already the president's rumors were spreading. She had a way of twisting truth faster than fire through dry grass. She told some that the man had illegally parked. She told others that his car was dangerous, blocking emergency access. She even hinted that he had forged papers to register it, each lie spreading like poison. And though most neighbors doubted her, they also feared her enough not to argue. As darkness fell, the man stood at his window looking at his car. The moonlight bounced off the hood, but his eyes were not on its shine. They were on the shadows moving near it. He noticed the president walking slowly on the sidewalk, pretending to take out trash even though it was not collection day. Her eyes kept drifting to his car, her hands brushing the air as if already measuring her next move. She stopped for a moment, stared directly at the vehicle, then turned and walked back, her steps quick and sharp. That night he could not sleep fully. Every sound outside caught his ear. The creak of a gate, the bark of a dog, the faint sound of heels on pavement. He got up twice to check the window, each time finding nothing but silence and the glowing body of his car sitting in the street. Yet his instincts told him this was not over. A notice was only the beginning. The president was planning more, something deeper, something meant to break not just his wallet but his spirit. He whispered to himself that he would not give her that satisfaction. In the morning the yellow paper still lay on the table, the fine waiting like a trap. He picked it up, folded it neatly, and placed it inside a drawer. He would not react yet, not until he understood her full game. But as he stepped outside once more, the neighbors waiting at the corner turned their heads, some with pity, some with fear, and in the middle of them, the HOA president stood tall with her clipboard, smiling with victory. In her mind she had already won the first battle. But what she did not know was that the man's silence was not weakness, it was patience. Patience that would soon reveal a storm of its own, and the real war between them had only just begun. That night the street was quiet but the silence felt heavy. The man had placed the violation notice away yet his mind stayed alert. Around midnight he heard a faint scrape outside. He moved to the window and saw a shadow moving near his car. At first he thought it was an animal but then the figure straightened. It was the HOA president herself, dressed in dark clothes, her hands clutching something that glinted under the weak streetlight. She looked around quickly then stepped closer to the car, her body stiff with focus. The man held his breath as he watched her raise her hand and press the object against the side of the vehicle. The sharp sound of metal dragging across paint cut through the night air. His heart clenched but he stayed still, watching her scratch a long line into the door. She paused, glanced around nervously, then moved to the front, her hand striking again. The windshield cracked under her blow. She worked fast but not careful enough. A neighbor's dog barked furiously at the noise. Lights flicked on in distant houses. But she kept going, her anger stronger than her fear. She bent down near the tire and thrust the sharp tool into the rubber. Air hissed out and the car sank slightly. She did the same to the other side, her breath ragged, her eyes shining with satisfaction. When she was done she stepped back and admired the damage. The once perfect car now looked wounded. Broken glass, glittering under the moon, scratches running deep across its body. She smirked and whispered to herself, then walked back quickly to her house, her shadow swallowed by the dark. The man stood frozen at the window, every muscle tight. He had seen enough to know the truth but his face remained calm. Instead of rushing outside he quietly turned to the corner of the room where a small camera light blinked. Earlier that evening he had placed a hidden camera facing the car. Something in his heart had warned him that night would bring trouble. Now the proof sat safe on the device, recording every move, every scratch, every strike. The HOA president had trapped herself. In the morning the neighborhood gasped at the sight. The man's brand new car looked destroyed, windshield shattered, deep scratches like scars across its surface, both tires flat. Children whispered in shock. Adults shook their heads but none dared speak too loudly. Across the street the HOA president appeared with her usual clipboard. Her expression calm as if she had no idea what had happened. She even put on a mask of pity, asking loudly if vandals had attacked during the night. Her voice carried just enough for everyone to hear. Neighbors glanced at each other nervously. No one believed her words fully but none wanted to confront her. Her reputation was too strong. The man inspected the car slowly, running his hands over the scratches, his face unreadable. The crowd expected anger or shouting but he gave none. He simply nodded, locked the car, and went back inside, leaving everyone confused. The president's smile returned. She thought she had broken him. She thought silence meant defeat. But inside his house the man sat with the memory card in his hand, the footage clear and sharp, the president's face exposed under the moonlight, her hands caught in the act, every second recorded. He watched it twice, then placed the card back carefully, patience still guiding him. Later that day rumors spread quickly. The president whispered to a group of women that the man's car was probably damaged because he had enemies elsewhere. She hinted at debts, at secrets, weaving lies like a spider spins webs. Some neighbors pretended to believe, others stayed quiet. But in their eyes doubt grew. Doubt that perhaps their leader was not as innocent as she pretended. The man saw the whispers, he heard the soft talk. But he did not defend himself. He let the silence do its work. For silence made people curious, and curiosity would soon turn against her. As night returned the car sat broken in the street, a reminder of cruelty and power. The man stood at his window again. But this time his expression carried a hint of something new, not sadness, not fear, but a quiet fire. A plan forming, because he knew a single truth. Power built on fear could collapse with a single truth revealed at the right time. and now he held that truth in his hands. Waiting, watching, preparing. The following morning the man stepped outside, the broken car still standing like a wounded soldier in front of his home. Neighbors stopped on their way to work and school, whispering, shaking their heads. Some pitied him, some feared what would come next. Across the street, the HOA president appeared again with her clipboard, her face full of fake concern. She spoke loudly about how unfortunate it was, how crime was rising, how maybe he should think about moving the car away from the street. Her voice was sharp yet sugar-coated. She wanted the crowd to hear her words and believe she cared. But her eyes betrayed her, cold and gleaming with victory. The man listened quietly, his hands in his pockets. He gave no answer. His silence spread unease through the crowd. Later that day she marched to his door, knocking hard as if it belonged to her. When he opened, she waved her papers in his face, claiming the car violated multiple sections of the HOA agreement. Her tone loud and commanding, her words twisting the rules until they sounded like law. She demanded he pay the fine immediately or face legal action. She leaned forward expecting to see fear in his eyes, but he only nodded slowly and took the paper from her hand. His calmness unsettled her. She snapped that he had 10 days and stormed off, her heels striking the pavement like hammers. Inside, the man sat at his table with both letters in front of him, the violation notice and the new threat. Beside them lay the memory card holding the truth. He stared at the items in silence, weighing each move carefully. He could expose her immediately, he could walk to the police and end it. But something inside told him the time was not yet right. Exposing her now would only reveal the surface. He wanted the whole neighborhood to see her for who she truly was. He wanted her downfall to be undeniable. In the evening, as the sun dropped and the streetlights flickered, neighbors gathered in small groups outside. The broken car had become the center of attention. Some whispered that vandals were to blame. Others whispered that it was no accident. Eyes drifted toward the HOA president, her face tight, her smile forced. She stood among them trying to steer the story, telling them that the man must have upset someone, that his silence meant guilt. Her voice sharp enough to cut through doubt. But doubt lingered. Her performance felt too practiced, her smile too thin. The man stepped outside with a broom in his hand. He began sweeping the glass from the street, his movements slow and calm. Every sweep made the neighbors quiet. They watched as he cleaned without a word, without anger, without asking for help. The sight made some uncomfortable, because silence carried weight. Silence made them wonder. Why wasn't he fighting? Why wasn't he shouting? What did he know that they didn't? The president crossed her arms, irritated by his calmness, anger flashing in her eyes. She wanted him broken, not steady. That night the man reviewed the footage again, each frame clear, her face, her hand holding the tool, the sound of glass breaking, all captured. He copied it to another device, placing it safely away. His plan was simple yet powerful. He would wait until the whole neighborhood gathered, until she felt untouchable, and then he would let the truth speak for itself. Patience, he told himself, patience breaks pride better than rage. The following day, the HOA president held a sudden meeting on the street, calling neighbors together. She raised her voice and declared that crime was rising because people were careless. She pointed at the man's car as an example, saying that leaving it outside invited trouble. She waved her clipboard as if it were a weapon, scolding and threatening. Some nodded out of habit, others looked uneasy. The man stood at the edge of the group, quiet, his eyes steady. His presence alone was enough to make her voice falter for a moment. When the meeting ended and people drifted away, whispers spread thicker than ever. One neighbor leaned to another saying they had heard strange noises last night. Another admitted seeing a shadow near the car. The seeds of suspicion were already planted. The man walked back to his home. His lips curved slightly, not in joy, but in readiness. The time was coming, and when it did, the silence would end. As the sun set, the HOA president looked out her window at the broken car, her smile gone, her hands tapping nervously on the sill. For the first time she felt a faint chill of doubt. A whisper in her mind asking if she had gone too far, but she shook it off, convincing herself that she was untouchable. She had ruled too long, controlled too many, no one could bring her down. She believed this until she closed her blinds, not knowing that her own downfall was already sealed, hidden in a small device inside the man's home, waiting for the right moment to strike. The morning sun rose slowly and the broken car still stood like a scar in front of his house. The neighbors passed by with curious eyes, whispering quietly, wondering why he still kept it there. Some thought he should move it. Some thought maybe he was too weak to fight. But he knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted it to stay there, a reminder of the truth. Across the street, the HOA president stepped out with her clipboard, her face calm but her steps sharp. She shouted across the street, pretending to be concerned again, telling him that the car was an eyesore and blocking community standards. Her voice carried with authority. She acted as if she was protecting the neighborhood when in reality she was hiding her crime. The man simply looked at her and gave no answer, and his silence once again made her uncomfortable. She turned away, her fake smile cracking at the edges. Hours later, the sound of a large engine rumbled down the street. Neighbors looked out of their windows and stepped onto porches. A tow truck rolled slowly toward the cul-de-sac. Its bright orange lights flashing, children pointed, adults whispered, and all eyes shifted to the man's car. Many assumed the truck had come for it. The president smiled smugly and folded her arms, whispering to the woman next to her that justice was finally arriving. Her heart raced with satisfaction. She imagined the car being dragged away as the whole neighborhood watched. She imagined herself standing tall, proving once again that she controlled everything. But as the truck stopped, the driver stepped out holding a paper in his hand. He walked right past the man's car without even looking at it. Instead, he stopped directly in front of the president's shiny luxury vehicle parked proudly near her driveway. The man leaned against his gate watching silently. The crowd grew tense. The president laughed nervously, demanding to know why the tow truck had stopped there. The driver spoke clearly, showing her the order signed by the city. Her car was in violation. Multiple unpaid fees attached to her name. Illegal modifications listed. Her smile froze. Her words stumbled. She shouted that it was a mistake, that there had to be an error. But the driver only shrugged and began hooking chains to her front wheels. The heavy clank of metal echoed through the street like a drumbeat. The neighbors gasped. Some even chuckled under their breath. They could not believe what they were seeing. The queen of rules, the woman who fined them for the smallest things, was now watching her own car being taken. She rushed forward, waving her clipboard, shouting that she was the HOA president and no one could touch her property. But the driver ignored her, calmly continuing his work. Her face turned red, her voice cracked. She demanded that neighbors step in to defend her. But none moved. They only stood watching, their silence louder than her screams. For the first time her power seemed weak. For the first time her rules seemed meaningless. The man stood calmly, his arms crossed, his eyes steady on her, his expression unreadable but filled with quiet strength. When the truck lifted her car, the tires rose slowly from the ground, her knees buckled. She cried out desperately, her voice breaking. She begged. She even tried to offer money on the spot. But the driver shook his head, saying it was out of his hands. The order had been signed and stamped. Nothing could stop it now. The chains rattled as the car tilted upward, the once proud symbol of her power hanging helplessly in the air. The neighbors whispered louder now, some taking out their phones, recording every second, her humiliation captured from every angle. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but sharp. He told her that no one was above the law, not even an HOA president. His words cut through the air and settled heavy in her chest. She turned to glare at him but saw only his steady eyes that held no fear, no anger, only truth. The truck roared as it pulled forward, dragging her car away, the sound fading slowly into the distance, leaving behind silence, leaving behind her shame. She stood frozen, her hands trembling, her clipboard slipping from her grasp and falling onto the pavement. The neighbors stared at her, some shaking their heads, some smiling faintly. The man turned back to his home, his steps slow and steady, his silence now carrying more weight than ever. The neighbors watched him go, whispers spreading. They began to see clearly what had always been hidden. They began to question the woman who had ruled them for years. The first crack had appeared in her throne of fear, and now it was spreading fast. She stood alone in the street, her car gone, her pride broken, her face pale, and for the first time in years, she realized she was no longer untouchable. The man's patience had begun to turn the tide. And this was only the beginning of her downfall. 2 days later, the air in the neighborhood felt different. People no longer looked at the HOA president with the same fear in their eyes. Whispers spread faster than fire and everyone remembered the sight of her car hanging from the tow truck. She tried to act normal, walking with her clipboard and pretending nothing had happened, but her steps were shaky. Her eyes darted quickly whenever someone whispered nearby. The man meanwhile remained calm, spending his mornings repairing small things around his home, greeting neighbors politely. His silence made people curious. They wondered if he was planning something bigger, and the truth was he was, because inside his mailbox that morning rested a thick envelope with official stamps. He opened it carefully and his eyes scanned the words. It was a legal notice, a letter addressed not to him but to the HOA president. Her violations listed in detail: unpaid HOA fees, misuse of funds, unapproved renovations on her own property, and even falsified documents she had filed to maintain her position. The letter was not just an accusation, it was a summons to appear in court. He folded the letter back inside and walked toward her house. Neighbors saw him cross the street and followed from a distance, curiosity pulling them. When he reached her door, he knocked calmly. After a moment she appeared, her eyes tired, her face pale. She tried to mask it with her usual arrogance, asking coldly what he wanted. Without a word he held out the letter. She frowned, her hands snatching it quickly, her eyes darting across the first lines. Her face drained of color. She stumbled back, her lips moved but no words came. The neighbors who had gathered whispered louder, trying to catch a glimpse. Her hand shook as she closed the door in his face. Inside she read it again and again, her breathing fast. Her empire built on fear and fake power was cracking. She had always believed rules applied only to others, never to her. But now the law had finally reached her doorstep. She paced back and forth, panic mixing with rage. She cursed his name under her breath, blaming him though deep down she knew these were her own actions catching up to her. Outside the man walked back slowly, his expression calm. The neighbors looked at him with new respect. Some approached quietly, thanking him for standing against her, telling him their own stories of being bullied and fined unfairly. One woman whispered that she had been forced to pay hundreds for leaving her decorations too long after a holiday. Another man admitted he had nearly moved away to escape her harassment. The man listened quietly to each story, nodding, but said little. His silence again felt stronger than 100 speeches. That evening the president tried to hold another meeting in the cul-de-sac. She rang bells and shouted for attention. But fewer people came this time, and those who stood around her crossed their arms, their faces no longer filled with fear but with suspicion. She tried to speak loudly, declaring that the letter was a mistake, that enemies were spreading lies. Her voice trembled as she claimed she was innocent. But her words rang hollow. The crowd only stared. Some shook their heads, others muttered that it was about time justice arrived. Her throat dried, her voice cracked. For the first time she felt powerless standing before the same people she once controlled. Back at his home the man sat near the window, the dim light of his lamp glowing softly. He replayed the camera footage once more, her shadow, her hand with the tool, the sound of glass breaking, every piece of evidence captured perfectly. He placed the copy inside a folder next to the court letter. Together they formed a chain strong enough to break her reign completely. Patience, he reminded himself, patience and timing, because the biggest blow had not yet come. It would arrive soon, and when it did, no one in the neighborhood would ever doubt again who she truly was. That night she could not sleep. She walked in circles inside her house, her clipboard lying forgotten on the floor, her phone buzzing with calls she did not answer. Each shadow outside her window felt like an accusation. Each creak in the woods sounded like footsteps coming for her. The weight of her own actions pressed down heavier with each passing hour, and she knew deep inside that the walls she had built with threats and fear were beginning to collapse. The silence of her enemy was louder than her screams, and the day of reckoning was closing in fast. The next morning the street was full of whispers. Neighbors walked slower, heads turning toward the HOA president's house. The once feared woman now seemed smaller. Her curtains stayed closed longer than usual. But when she finally stepped out clutching her clipboard, her eyes darted left and right, her smile forced. She greeted a few neighbors but none greeted her back the same way. Some turned away. Some pretended not to hear her. Power was slipping like sand through her fingers. Meanwhile the man walked calmly to his mailbox. His shoulders relaxed, and when he greeted people, they smiled genuinely. They leaned closer, whispering their frustrations, telling him quietly what she had done to them in the past. One by one their stories spilled like water breaking through a dam. An older man admitted she had fined him for keeping a small garden shed that had stood there for 20 years before she became president. A young mother shared how she was forced to pay nearly $1,000 because her children left bicycles on the lawn. Another neighbor shook his head angrily, saying she once threatened to sue him for painting his fence a color she didn't like. All these voices grew louder, and for the first time people were not afraid to speak openly. They gathered Around the man, their words pouring out, their anger finally finding a place to rest. Across the street the president noticed the small crowd forming, her lips tightened. She marched over, clipboard in hand, demanding to know what was going on. But as she approached, the group fell silent, eyes shifting to her with coldness. She raised her chin and tried to lecture them about rules and order. But before she could finish, the young mother spoke up, her voice shaking but strong. She told everyone what the president had done to her family, the fine, the threats, the tears, her words cracked the silence like thunder. The president's eyes widened. She tried to interrupt but another voice rose. The older man stepped forward and shouted his story too. Then another neighbor, and another, until their voices overlapped, a storm of confessions against her. The president's face flushed red. She raised her voice, waving her clipboard wildly, calling them liars, troublemakers, ungrateful people. But the more she shouted, the less power her words carried. The crowd only grew louder, their voices mixing into one. For years they had been silent, but now they had each other, now they had courage, and she was outnumbered. Her clipboard shook in her hand, her lips trembled. She screamed that she was still in charge, but her voice cracked and neighbors only stared at her with disgust. The man stood quietly at the edge of the group, his arms folded, his eyes calm. He did not need to speak. The neighbors were speaking for him. The power that once belonged to her had shifted. It now lived in the voices of those she had tried to control, and each voice was another nail in the coffin of her authority. By evening the whole neighborhood knew what had happened. Word spread from door to door. Even those who had once supported her were now silent. Some avoided her completely, others whispered louder than ever. Children pointed when she walked by, mocking her. The president slammed her door shut and stayed inside, her curtains drawn, her clipboard lying useless on the kitchen counter, her power broken not by force but by the truth finally spoken aloud. Inside his home the man sat in the dim light, the memory card safe, the legal letter tucked carefully away. He listened to the sounds outside, neighbors chatting freely, laughter returning to the street after so long. He closed his eyes for a moment, knowing this was only the beginning. The final blow had not yet landed, but the ground was ready. The cracks in her throne were wide open, and all it would take was one more push, one final truth revealed, to end her reign completely. That night, while she sat alone in her darkened living room, her hands trembling, her mind racing with fear of losing everything, he sat calmly in his chair, watching the footage once more, her shadow, her hammer, the sound of glass breaking, the undeniable proof of her guilt. The moment that would turn whispers into judgment. He whispered to himself softly, patience, just a little more patience, because soon the whole neighborhood would see, and once they saw, there would be no turning back. The following weekend the HOA board called for a community meeting in the small park at the center of the neighborhood. Usually these meetings were quiet, with the president speaking loudly while everyone else listened in silence. But this time the air felt heavier. Neighbors whispered in groups, their eyes full of doubt and anger. When the president arrived she held her clipboard tight, her face pale but painted with a forced smile. She climbed onto the small platform and cleared her throat. Her voice loud as she declared that the neighborhood was falling apart because people were spreading lies. She pointed at the man, accusing him of turning everyone against her, saying he was the reason for chaos. She called him a troublemaker, a liar, even hinted that he was dangerous. Her words rang out across the park but they carried less weight than before. The crowd crossed their arms, their faces cold, some even laughed bitterly. The man stood quietly among them, his hands steady. He waited until she finished her long speech, her voice rising higher with desperation. Then he stepped forward slowly, all eyes turned to him. The crowd grew silent. The president sneered, demanding to know if he had anything to say. She expected him to argue, to shout, to lose control. But instead he pulled a small device from his pocket. He raised it and pressed a button. A screen flickered to life on a portable projector he had quietly arranged with a neighbor. Gasps filled the air as the first image appeared, grainy yet clear enough to see the HOA president in the middle of the night, her figure hunched near his car, a tool in her hand. The video played, the sound of glass breaking echoed across the park, the sight of her scratching the paint, slashing the tires, striking the windshield. Every neighbor froze, mouths open, eyes wide. Some covered their mouths in shock, others whispered loudly, pointing at her trembling figure. The president's face turned white. She stuttered, shouting that it was fake, that it had been edited. But the video continued, frame after frame, until there was no denying the truth. Every detail. Captured clearly, her face, her actions, the destruction, the proof undeniable. The crowd erupted, voices shouting, some demanding she resign, others cursing her name. The young mother who had spoken before cried out that this was the woman who fined her for bicycles. And yet here she was destroying property herself. The older man shook his head in disgust, saying he had always known she was corrupt. The noise grew louder, angrier, like a storm breaking through. The president tried to shout over them, but her voice drowned. Her clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the ground. She looked around desperately but found no allies. Even her closest supporters backed away, ashamed and afraid. The man did not gloat, he did not raise his voice, he simply stood steady, his calm presence a sharp contrast to her trembling body. He let the video speak. He let the truth tear down her walls. When the clip ended, silence fell for a moment, all eyes on her, waiting, judging. Her lips moved but no words came, her knees shook, and finally she stumbled back, muttering that it was all lies, but no one believed her. The weight of evidence crushed her denial. A member of the HOA board stood up, his voice firm. He said enough was enough, that they could no longer trust her leadership. He called for an immediate vote. Hands rose all around, neighbor after neighbor raising their arms, the majority overwhelming. Her power stripped away right in front of everyone. She cried out, begged, threatened, even promised to change. But no one listened. The decision was sealed, her reign ended. The clipboard that once symbolized her control lay abandoned in the dirt. The man quietly turned off the projector, slipped the device back into his pocket, and walked away without a word. The crowd followed him with their eyes, respect shining in their faces, while the president stood alone, shaking, her empire of fear destroyed by the very people she once ruled. And all it had taken was patience, silence, and the right moment to reveal the truth. The neighborhood had seen her real face, and now there was no going back. The sun was sinking low when the HOA board gathered under the shade of the park pavilion. The air was heavy with tension. Neighbors crowded around, their voices sharp with anger. The president sat stiff on a folding chair, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her clipboard lay forgotten at her feet. She tried to raise her head high, but her eyes betrayed her fear. The man stood quietly at the back, his calm presence like a stone in a storm. He did not need to speak anymore. The truth had already spoken for him. The board members shuffled papers nervously, but the pressure from the crowd pushed them forward. One of them cleared his throat and said it was time to decide. The president suddenly leapt to her feet, her voice loud and shrill. She declared that everything was a setup, that the video was fake, that people were jealous of her hard work. She shouted that without her the neighborhood would fall apart. Her words came fast and frantic, but they only echoed against the silence of the crowd. No one nodded, no one clapped. The same people who once followed her orders now looked at her with cold eyes. Children hid behind their parents. Adults shook their heads. Whispers carried through the air like knives. A board member spoke firmly, saying the evidence was undeniable, saying the neighborhood deserved honesty and fairness, not fear and lies. Another board member added that this was not just about one car but years of abuse, years of unfair fines and threats. People began to speak up one after another, voices overlapping, telling stories of her cruelty, each confession another weight pressing her lower into her chair. Her shoulders slumped as the storm of voices surrounded her. She tried to interrupt, but they drowned her out. Finally the board called for the vote. Hands rose quickly, neighbors lifting their arms high. The board counted, one by one, until the decision was clear, the majority overwhelming. She was removed as HOA president effective immediately. Gasps rippled through the crowd, then applause, then cheers. The sound filled the park, years of frustration breaking free all at once. The president staggered back, her mouth open, her face pale. She screamed that it was illegal, that she would fight it. But no one listened. Her voice was swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The man remained quiet, his eyes steady. He watched as the board collected her keys, her documents, stripping her of the power she had clutched for so long. Her clipboard was handed to another board member. A symbol that the crown she wore had been taken. She cried out, trying to grab it back, but her hands were slapped away. She collapsed into her chair, tears running down her face, her pride shattered, her power gone. The neighbors who once feared her now stood tall, their faces bright with relief. The board declared that new leadership would be chosen soon, someone fair, someone who listened. The neighbors nodded, some even clapped. The park that had once echoed with her orders now echoed with freedom. The man turned and walked slowly home, his steps steady, his silence louder than ever. Behind him the crowd continued to cheer. The president sat alone, shaking, surrounded not by fear but by judgment, her empire of control gone forever. That night the neighborhood felt lighter. Children laughed in the streets, families gathered on porches, people who had been afraid for years finally smiled freely. The man sat by his window sipping tea. The broken car still parked outside like a silent witness, the proof of patience and truth. He glanced across the street where the president's windows were dark, her house heavy with silence, and he knew she was inside, drowning in her shame. The final vote had ended her rule. But her punishment was far from over. Tomorrow would bring the last blow, the one she could not escape, and he was ready for it. The next morning the neighborhood woke to the sound of another heavy engine rumbling slowly down the street. Curtains shifted, doors opened, people stepped outside with curious faces. The man was already standing calmly by his gate, sipping his tea, his eyes steady. Across the street the former HOA president burst out of her door in panic when she saw the tow truck stopping in front of her house. Her voice rose immediately, sharp and trembling. She shouted at the driver before he even stepped out, insisting there must be a mistake, insisting that her car had already been taken once and that this was harassment. But the driver only lifted a hand holding papers stamped with authority, her name written clearly, repossession order for unpaid debts and violations. The neighbors gathered quickly, whispers rising. Phones lifted to record. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. She clutched her hair, pacing frantically, shouting at the driver, shouting at the crowd, even shouting at the man across the street, blaming him for everything. Her words spilled like poison, calling him a liar, a manipulator, even accusing the neighbors of betrayal. But no one defended her, no one stepped forward. The silence of the crowd was her true punishment. They stood with folded arms and cold faces, their eyes sharp, the same people she had ruled through fear now watching her crumble. With satisfaction, the driver calmly hooked chains to the front of her car, the clank of steel echoing like a drumbeat of justice. She ran forward trying to block him, tears streaming down her face, begging, offering to pay in cash, offering favors, anything to stop it. But the driver did not listen. The order was final. The man set his cup aside and leaned against his gate, his calm presence cutting through the chaos. When her eyes met his she saw no anger, no gloating, only the same silence that had haunted her from the beginning. It broke her more than shouting ever could. She screamed that he had destroyed her life, that he had turned everyone against her. But deep inside she knew it was not him, it was the evidence, the truth, and her own actions that had finally caught up with her. The tow truck roared, pulling her car slowly forward, the tires rolling reluctantly. Her hands slapped the hood desperately but the chains pulled it away, dragging her pride down the street for everyone to see. The neighbors clapped softly, some laughed, others simply watched in silence, the weight of years lifting from their shoulders. She fell to her knees in the middle of the street, sobbing, her voice hoarse, begging the crowd to forgive her, promising to change. But no one moved, no one comforted her. The board members stood at the edge of the group, their faces stern, saying nothing, letting the moment burn into memory. Because it was the final chapter of her reign. The woman who had once fined them, threatened them, broken their peace, now sat powerless, broken herself, her clipboard gone, her car gone, her respect gone. The man turned slowly and walked back into his house, his steps steady, his shoulders calm. He did not need to say a single word. His patience and silence had already spoken louder than anything else. Inside he placed the folder containing the footage and documents into a drawer, locking it away, his task complete. Outside the neighbors began to cheer openly. Children played freely on the street for the first time in years without fear of being yelled at. Laughter rose where silence once lived. The air of the neighborhood felt lighter, fresher, as if chains had been lifted. Across the street the former president dragged herself to her porch, her eyes hollow, her body shaking. She looked around but saw no friends, no allies, only faces that once bowed to her now turned away. She disappeared into her house and shut the door, her empire gone forever. And the street that had once been ruled by her clipboard now belonged to the people again. The man stood at his window watching quietly, the broken pieces of his car still glimmering faintly under the sun, a reminder of the battle that had been fought, a reminder that sometimes silence and patience are stronger than rage. And with that thought he closed the curtain, knowing the story of her downfall was finally complete.